Hey, so that's a good question, but also a very concerning one because if the President of the United States starts defying judicial rulings, you're going to get a situation where there is a constitutional crisis, as the judicial branch effectively will lack direct enforcement power. And basically, what would happen then is, the rulings, even though they are going to remain legally binding, the president would be in violation of the Constitution of the United States. And essentially, the lower courts and the federal agencies may still enforce the decision depending on the ruling of the scope. But you think about the lower federal courts, which, are, filled with lots of conservative judges, but also Democrats as well. And you also think about, federal agencies enforcing this. Who's controlling the federal agencies and who are they being filled? Essentially, who's filling those positions? Trump loyalists are filling those positions, and they're under the direction of Donald Trump. Essentially, for the first time since Watergate, we have a situation where the Justice Department effectively is operating as the president's prosecutorial firing squad. Donald Trump's relationship with the Attorney General Pam Bondi is completely inappropriate in terms of the rule of law and the separation of those powers. The President of the United States is not supposed to be at all in a close relationship with the FBI director, the Supreme Court, or essentially the Attorney General of the United States. And that all of that is broken right now. And of course, the next step would be a congressional response, impeachment, legislative actions. That's not going to happen under a red Republican-controlled Congress. So what we could see is Democrats with the Oversight Committee, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, also Congressman Jamie Raskin, begin to start looking into this as something that needs to be investigated because it's quite very serious. You also have, the public and state level resistance, where we have the situation of where, mass protests, mass people calling their members of Congress, reporting that this is happening, that the government is in constitutional crisis. There are already reports of representatives in Congress receiving lots of phone calls per minute. And I will say sort of a historical example for this is initially Richard Nixon did resist a Supreme Court ruling, essentially United States v. Nixon. But he ultimately did comply in handing over the Watergate tapes. So that is something of constitutional defiance, putting the country into a moment of constitutional crisis. But this is something that Donald Trump most likely is not going to capitulate to, especially if his vice president and entire administration is on board. And that's the absolute concerning part. A constitutional crisis building in the country because the president of the United States is openly defying a ruling from a federal judge. And you also, last but not least, have this, concerning, horrific factor, essentially that if the ruling affects military or law enforcement, they must decide whether to follow the court or the president. So this could lead to a constitutional showdown between the branches of government, as Trump is already effectively trying to sideline the legislative branch by just going through and signing executive order after executive order. But him also trying to sideline the judicial branch is effectively ending the three branches of government. And that's something that it's scary. And it's right in terms of what's happening, but it's also something to keep an eye on because we're really uncertain about how this could unfold. But this is what we call a nonviolent takeover of the federal government, something that is talked about here in this book, How Democracies Die, in terms of how democracies die in the 21st century. It is not always shots being fired. It's not always a military, taking over in terms of a coup of a country. What it looks like now in the 21st century is exactly what Donald Trump is doing, defying the judicial branch and sidelining the legislative branch, effectively making himself all powerful, becoming a dictator in the United States.